Hello.
Hi.
For the record, do I have your permission to videotape this interview and share it when we're finished?
Yes.
Okay. So can you please tell me your name and how it's spelled?
My name is Fongsiene Chang, Fongsiene. Last name Chang, Chang.
And was this the name that you were given when you were born?
Yes.
And do you ever go by a different name?
Susan.
Why do you sometimes go by Susan instead of Fongsiene?
Well, in 1980, our family was sponsored to come to America from a Thai refugee camp in 1980. And when we arrived, in order to immerse and assimilate us into the American culture, they thought it would be a good idea to give us English names so that it would be easier for people to pronounce and just to help us to blend in with the American culture easier.
And you said that you came to America from a Thai refugee camp. What country were you born in?
I was born in northern Laos, which borders China, and my parents' family are Chinese, but I believe for generations they have lived in northern Laos, bordering northern China, but they are full Chinese.
So you say that your mother and father are both full Chinese. Were they both born in China?
I don't believe they were born in China. That's why I say that their family, both of them, have lived in northern Laos for many generations, but they were originally from China.
And could you tell me what your parents' names are?
My dad's name is Yaming, and my mom's name is Yang.
So, do you have any brothers or sisters in your family?
I have one older brother who is about 2.5 years older than I am. I have an oldest sister who is about 5 years older than I am, but sadly she passed away last year. And I have a youngest sister, Gwen, who lives in Brooklyn, New York with her family.
Before we talk about when you came to this country, are there any other interesting things about your family that you think we should know?
Yes, so I like to say our family we're Chinese but born in Laos. And the interesting thing I want to mention is my mom and dad, they did not have a traditional marriage in the sense that they didn't meet, fall in love, and chose to get married, but that it was an arranged marriage. So my grandmother, who is my mom's mother, knew my dad, knew of him, and thought that he was a good candidate for a husband. So she actually made my mom marry my dad. And of course, when you begin a marriage like that, it could be quite tumultuous at times.
Would you say that your parents had a good marriage, even though it was an arranged one, if you don't mind me asking?
You know, I think it was good and bad. They went through their phases where it was okay, and then they went through their phases when there were stresses. In particular, when we first came to America, it was quite stressful because both of my parents and the kids, we did not speak English. And so stresses of that, having to find a job, and being in a town called Kingsport, Tennessee, where we were the only Asian family. And so all that was very stressful and confusing and scary. And I think that put a lot of stress in their relationship. So there was arguments and things like that.
So, if you can remember, when did your family come to the United States?
We arrived in Kingsport, Tennessee in 1980, so I was probably about 8 or 9. And the interesting thing was when up until the age of 5 or 6, maybe 7, as I get older, my memory is getting less sketchy. So before I was 5 or 6, maybe 7, I had really good childhood memories from when we were living in our home in Laos. But I think it was a few years after the Vietnam War, my parents felt that we had to leave Laos, primarily because my dad, Ming, was working for a Western company as a truck driver. He drove a Pepsi Cola truck. And so after the war was over, there was whispers of the Communist Party rounding up Western sympathizers. So my dad was afraid that because he worked for Pepsi Cola, he might be one of those rounded up. So they made the first attempt for us to cross the Mekong River into Thailand, but that failed. And then we made a second attempt, I don't know how much later, but we made a second attempt across the Mekong, and then we were successful. And obviously there were other families that hired the same people to help those who wanted to escape Laos to cross the river into Thailand, I think they have many refugee camps into Thailand. But for years, up until 15 years ago, I want to say, I had always thought that we had only had one attempt crossing, but obviously there were two. And interestingly, my brother, who was 2.5 years older than me, my grandmother on my mom's side took him when he was about 2, 3, or 4, I'm not sure, but very young. She took him an attempt to cross the Mekong into Thailand, but they were captured by the Laos government and they were imprisoned for maybe a week or two. My grandmother and my brother when he was a toddler, maybe a year or two older than that. But I think after a week or two they were released. So, and I did not know any of this until when I was well into my adulthood.
It sounds like the journey from Laos into Thailand was difficult. Are there any difficult parts of that journey that you remember personally and weren't told about later in life?
I do remember that when the second crossing, that we were successful. I remember that it was under the cover of night. I remember sitting on the bank of the river on the Laos side waiting to be picked up by boats. I remember that there were other family members with us. I remember digging my toes into the wet sand and that it was cold. I remember that there was a family that had a crying baby, and of course, close by there was security towers, and of course the soldiers they have weapons with them. So the people who were hired to help the family cross the Mekong, they were afraid of being discovered. So I think I heard, like I say, my memory is a little bit sketchy now, it's been so long, but I've always remembered that someone had said we need to quiet the baby. And I thought quieting mean that they had to maybe get rid of the baby. So I'm not sure what happened to that baby. All I can remember was we crossed the river, we were successful, and we were led to the Thai refugee camp. And that's where we stayed for a good 2 or 3 years, I want to say. And to me, as a child that age, I did not know that that was a refugee camp. Because in the camp, it was very, very large. We had our own house, and I think we even had a garden in the backyard with an outhouse. We raised pigs, ducks, and chickens. We had, fruit trees in the backyard. So to me, now that I'm adult, knowing that I lived in a refugee camp, I'm like, oh, that was a pretty nice one, I guess. But anyway, I do remember a few years after being there, there was a huge fire that wiped out the entire refugee camp. And we lost everything, all photos. We lost everything because the homes, what you might call shacks, were built with, lumber, I think thatch roofs, things that caught on fire fairly quick and would spread. So we lost everything in that fire. I do not have any baby photos of myself. The youngest photos of I have of me is probably when I was 4 or 5. I'm very, very sad about that. I do not know what I look like as a baby.
So when you first came to America, where did you land?
We did land in Tennessee. And so then we went to Kingsport, and the organization that sponsored our little family was a Presbyterian pastor and his congregation. And so before we arrived, they had a house for us that was furnished, there was clothes, there were toys. So they had everything ready for us when we came. And that's where we stayed for 2 years, but we had to go to church every Sunday. And we didn't understand what the sermon was about because we didn't speak the language. And so when I came to America in 1980, I was 9, I believe, because I was supposed to start 4th grade at 9 years old, but they put me in 3rd grade because I didn't speak the English. And I remember my teacher's name, Mrs. Worley, an elderly, curly hair, a white lady, very, very nice. And I remember my teacher teaching me how to speak English was to put on headphones and listen to tapes in English. And I believe there was a translator that did come in. I don't know how often, it's been so long. But I remember they did have a translator for us as well at the school. But I only have good, positive memories from our time in Kingsport, Tennessee, other than having to go to church once a week, didn't understand what was being said. But anyway, I only have very positive memories. I remember making friends. I had a couple of best friends. I just remember that the kids were very nice, very welcoming. I remember Mrs. Worley had a huge impact on me. She was such a welcoming, caring teacher. And years later, I became a teacher myself.
So when you first came here and growing up, what differences did you notice about the cultures of Laos or Thailand compared to America?
Well, in America, people wear shoes because I remember when I was little in the Laos village and also in the Thai refugee camp, oftentimes kids would just run around shoeless. That was normal. Let's see, also, obviously, we didn't have just like a Fry's or a Safeway grocery store that we would go and get packaged foods that's already been gutted and clean and packaged for you. I mean, we raised our own fruits and vegetables, and sometimes, you have farm animals that you raise that you would butcher for food, so.
Interesting. So when did you decide to move from Tennessee to Arizona?
I think we were in Tennessee for maybe 2 or 3 years. And the thing about Tennessee was the population was, I'm going to say, 99.99 white folks. And I think we were the 0.01 minority, the only family. So when I first watched, okay, let me backtrack. Before we came to America, when we were at the Thai refugee camp, we thought we were going to go to France, that we were going to be sponsored to France. And so the people at the Thai refugee camp started teaching us a little bit of French. But then when they found out, oh no, we're going to be sponsored to America, I do remember them trying to teach us a little bit of English, but it wasn't, we can carry a conversation in English at all. It was just a word here and there in English. So, what's the question?
The question was, when did you move to Arizona? But you gave a lot of interesting information. And you also said that you had some trouble learning English when you first came here. What was the experience of learning a new language like after you'd already moved to a country that spoke English?
You know, that is bittersweet, right? I believe that if you move to a country, you should learn that country's language to get along with that culture and society. I think people should do that. But I just have really positive memory in Tennessee in third grade, Mrs. Worley teaching me how to speak English and the kids being very nice and friendly and warm. Um,
So, can you describe some of the places that you would have called home growing up? I know that you said you were born in Laos, then moved to a Thai refugee camp, then came to Tennessee, and now you live in Arizona.
yes, so when we moved to Arizona, when we were living in Kingsport, Tennessee, all I saw were Caucasians. I have never seen a black person or a Hispanic person or a Native American person. I have never seen any other races. So the funny thing was, before we came to America, at the refugee camp, they would show movies. And one night, you know, they would put up a big projector screen and everybody would come and watch it. And it was a war movie, and I don't know, it was Platoon or Full Metal Jacket. I don't know which movie it was. I just remember the scene that a soldier was rising out of the swamp or river, and he had blue eyes, and a lot of the kids were pointing like, monster, monster, because we have never seen anyone who had blue eyes and fair skin. But so when we came to Arizona, my dad came first to find a job and find a place for us to live. So he came out first, and I think he was out here by himself months, I believe. And then we came out here and we took the Greyhound. Can you imagine? You know, my mom, the four of us, we boarded the Greyhound from Kingsport, Tennessee, and made that trek all the way to Phoenix, Arizona. And to this day, I cannot get on the Greyhound without feeling nauseous, because back then, of course, you didn't have a bus that was smoke free and a bus that you could smoke. So I just remember that awful smell of tobacco and cigarettes on that bus. And to this day, I cannot get on the Greyhound bus without feeling nauseous. I think it's just the memory, obviously, of that. So we came out here to Phoenix, Arizona, and my dad had found a job at a Chinese restaurant as a cook. So he didn't have to, you know, speak to customers really. He still did not know the language very well. Now, my mom, when we were 2 years in Kingsport, Tennessee, she worked full-time at a restaurant, and but she also wanted to better herself. So she went to night class to learn English. And when we were at Kingsport, Tennessee, we were also put on welfare, and my mom did not like that at all. The reason being was, she said when she would go to the store and she would take out, because back then we did not have the cards that the government give you. Back then it was a booklet of fake money, and that's what you would pull out to pay for your groceries. So, and she said that oftentimes when she would go to the grocery store to buy food, you know, she felt that she was getting some stares that she didn't appreciate. So in 2 years, believe it or not, my mom and dad worked and worked until they got us off of welfare. So back to Arizona. So my dad found a duplex, and we are a family of 6. So our duplex was a 2-bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. So all 4 kids shared a bedroom, and then my mom and dad were in the other one. And this is when their life was quite stressful, and there were arguments and, you know, conflict in the house. And my dad was, shall we say, not a very nice dad. He was abusive, verbally and physically abusive, you know. But I think that was also part of the Asian culture. You know, they don't think twice about spanking their kids or taking a stick and or a broom handle and, you know, as punishment. That was quite common in our culture.
So, this duplex, Was that the place that you settled down permanently when you came to America, or did you eventually move to a more permanent residence?
Well, we stayed in the duplex for quite a while, and it was I want to say Camelback and 7th Avenue, around that area where the duplex is. So we stayed there for quite a while, and but then my mom and dad have always worked in Chinese restaurants. She was always a waitress. My dad was always a cook. And they would work a lot, 6-7 days a week. And they tell me that before we came to America, I was a fluent Chinese speaker. So I spoke Laos and I spoke Chinese. But since we came to America, my parents worked a lot, so they were out of the house a lot. And so just like the saying goes, you know, you don't use it, you lose it. So I am no longer a fluent Mandarin Cantonese speaker. I feel very sad about that. And then, so we lived there for quite a while. They worked as waitresses. My mom was always a waitress, hostess. My dad was always a cook, and they were able to save up some money. And my dad had a friend who wanted to open a restaurant out in Sun City. There was a restaurant for sale, and so he went into partnership with his friend of his, and together they opened this restaurant in Sun City, a Chinese restaurant on 99th Avenue in Thunderbird, and they named it Chang Li. Chang because that's our last name, and Li because that was his partner's last name, so Chang Li restaurant. And so they went into partnership with him, doing that for a while, and they were able to save up money and moved from Camelback all the way out to the West Valley on 59th Avenue in Cactus, and they purchased a home there. And my mom and dad have been there ever since. And today they are almost in their 80s.
So what memories do you have from your father? What ones stick out the most to you now that you're older?
You know, what I remember about my dad was growing up with him as a father was very tumultuous and violent and abusive. So to say I do not have a good relationship with my dad because he does not know how to talk to his kids. It's more like talk to, lecture. That's how he would communicate to us. And it's because when he was little, he lost his parents before he was 2, I think, and he was raised by family. So he had a tough childhood as well, and I don't think he has never learned how to be a responsible person, did not have a good father figure or role model in his life, so he did not know how to be a good father. But having him as a dad was tough. Like I say, it was abusive, it was violent, and at times, but now that he's, you know, in his golden years, the way I think about it is, he's in his golden years. Even though it was a tough childhood for us, he was working hard and he was able to afford a home for us. You know, we didn't go hungry, we didn't go homeless, we had clothes, but we didn't have the other part that is equally important, you know, a father who is supportive and can communicate with his kids correctly, and his wife.
And speaking of his wife, what memories do you have of your mother?
I would say I am close to my mom because she was not violent or abusive towards us. If anything, she was protective of us. So I'm close to my mom, especially now that we've lost my sister, and now that my mom is older, we've become very close.
What do you remember most about growing up in Laos and Thailand?
I remember not going to school. There was no school. I remember just, pretty much left to ourselves to do what we want. I remember, we would go out into a big field and catch bugs like grasshoppers and play with chickens on the dirt road. Um, so I only have good memories. Um, and just being free and running around barefoot. I remember at the Thai refugee camp, because we did have a little farm in our backyard, the way that we would feed our animals was our parents expected us to, two of us would have a long stick, one on each end, and a bucket strung in the middle. And so we would go from door to door asking for leftover food, what you would call slop. And then we would bring it home and feed the animals. And we had a well in the backyard also. So, it almost seems idyllic as a child when I remember this. But I'm sure my parents, when they look back, I'm sure it was a very tough life. I just, so young, I didn't realize that we were stuck in a refugee camp, that we were not allowed to go freely in and out of this camp. You were just contained in this camp. But I did not know that, because as a kid, I could just go wherever I wanted, and it was a huge, huge camp. It was like a little city. So I did not know. But I do remember that there would be trucks that would come and would give us donated clothes and donated food. I remember waiting in line for the clothes and for the food, and I don't know why I remember this, but there was dried fish that they would give to us. But to hear my mom talk about it, life was very hard. They didn't have money, and they had to work very, very hard. Now, there was selling and buying going on in refugee camp. People would, make food or products and sell it to other refugees in the camp. So they did do a little bit of that.
So you said that you didn't go to any school in Laos or the refugee camp in Thailand. Do you remember getting any sort of informal education?
Nope, there was no education whatsoever. I did not go to school until I came to America, until I was 9 years old.
Did you have any childhood friends? And if so, what do you remember about them?
I don't remember having friends before coming to America. I remember having friends when I was in third grade in Mrs. Worley's class. I remember I had lots of friends. I remember I have two best friends, and to this day I still remember their names, Tara and Ginger. And to this day I still wonder how they turned out. Now and then I do wonder about that. And I remember having my first crush in that class as a third grader, and his name was Bobby.
So what sort of activities would you do for fun at that age when you were in school?
I like the playground. I remember going out to play in the playground during recess. I remember that we have a dog, a little black dog named Blackie. I understand now that that can sound offensive, but that's not what was in our mind. We saw that this little dog was black, so we called him Blackie. I remember we had a pet. I remember too that once a month, the church group would take us to, what was the shoe store? I can't remember now. It was a popular shoe store chain. This would make it like 40 plus years ago, but they would take us there every once a month to get new shoes.
And then can you tell me about the type of interactions you had with people who were from a different culture, with you coming from Laos and Thailand versus them being born and raised in America?
Well, I think that, in our culture, maybe our family, but I think it's typical of Asian cultures where, for us, we listen to what our parents say. They tell us what to do and we do it. I think in let's say a Caucasian culture, I think they communicate with their kids much better, check in to see how they're feeling, get their opinions on things, get their input. Well, in our culture, in our family, there wasn't any of that. You're going to do this and you're going to do that, and this is how you're going to do it. It was strict. Um, and in our culture, too, in our family in particular, believe it or not, but I have never, ever, ever say to my mom and dad that I love them. I love you, and they have never said it to me either. That's just not how we show love. And I have never really full on hugged my mom or my dad ever. It would be very awkward for me to do so. So in our family, the way we show love is food. When we go to their house, oh, you want something to eat? That means I love you. My mom would often call and say, oh, I made this, come get some. It's, I love you. So for us, we show love through food and making sure that the kids are fed. So I would say maybe our love language is food.
Speaking of food, when you think back to growing up in Laos or eating with your family when you moved here, what kind of foods come to mind?
Very fresh foods, lots of vegetables, very little meat, very spicy, very pungent. Sometimes a lot of the fruits and vegetables would come from your own garden. And to this day, my mom has a huge garden in her backyard. So it's just very fresh, very pungent, very spicy type of foods.
So in your family, what would be a typical breakfast?
Typical breakfast, probably congee. What it is just rice cooked in water, and then you would eat it with pickled vegetable or fermented tofu.
So what about a lunch or a dinner?
Lunch and dinner, I think all our meals has some kind of rice, be it sticky rice or steamed rice, and then there would be lots of vegetable dishes, a few meat dishes, sometimes soups with it, noodles.
And then what American food do you remember tasting for the first time?
An apple. And I will always remember this because I did not taste an apple until I was 9. And I had this apple when we were in transit coming to America. And I believe we had to make 2 or 3 stops, one of which was at an airport, and I don't know it was in South Korea or in China. I am not sure, but I know it was in Asia somewhere. And someone gave me an apple. I don't remember who, but I tasted that apple for the first time when I was 8 or 9, and it was delicious. I just remember it was so good.
So what would you say your favorite American foods were?
My favorite American food has to be the Thanksgiving meal. And you can't have that Thanksgiving meal without the cranberry sauce. So I love the Thanksgiving meal spread, and I cook it myself as well. But that is my favorite American meal.
So in your home country, what were the restaurants like, if there were any?
There were no restaurants in the refugee camp. They might have been, but I don't remember. And then of course I lived there only until I was up to 5 or 6, so I don't remember going to a restaurant in northern Laos in our village.
When you were home, what responsibilities did you and your brother and sisters have?
I had none. Unfortunately, I was a very lazy teenager. I didn't realize how hard it is to work full-time and also to maintain a house. And I was very lazy as a teenager throughout my whole high school years, my junior high years. I don't remember helping to clean the house, cook, or anything like that. And ironically, my brother, my oldest brother, who is 2 years older than me, was the one who was more of the cleaning of the house and that. And And to this day, I regret that a lot because obviously, when you have your own house and your own children, that's when you begin to realize I was not very helpful. But of course, it's too late to do anything about it now. But I was not a very helpful teenager. Growing up, I pretty much kept to myself. My parents were working all the time. I was very shy. I read a lot of books, and the books that I read were romance novels. I remember going to Goodwill and other thrift stores buying used romance novels, and I would like consume a lot of it. But yeah, I do greatly, even to this day, I regret not helping out around the house. Now, when my parents have the restaurant, Changli Restaurant, it was throughout my high school years. So we did, as kids, worked at the restaurant. We did work. So I started working when I was 12 or 13 in the restaurant.
So at home or in the restaurant, what were the differences between the responsibilities that belong to the women and the ones that belong to the men, if there were any?
You know, I don't remember my dad doing any household chores. I think it was largely, my mom. At the restaurant, obviously, he did a lot of work. You know, he was in the back of the kitchen, and my mom was in the front of the kitchen, cleaning, vacuuming, things like that. And my dad would be prepping the food, cleaning the woks, doing the dishes if we didn't have a dishwasher. So they had traditional roles.
So when you had a day to rest, how would your family spend their relaxation time?
You know, I remember my dad taking us to Encanto Park in Phoenix, and he just loves that park. And so we would go there quite often because, there's like a little river, man-made river, and you can rent paddle boats. There's always lots of ducks and geese there. It's a huge place. And I remember he would take us there a lot.
If you don't mind, could we talk more about your life in Laos and leaving for the Thai refugee camp?
Sure.
So how old were you again when you left Laos?
I want to say I was probably 5 or 6. That's my best recollection. I think I was 5 or 6. And the older I get, I don't trust my memory anymore. I often think, boy, did this really happen? But that's the same thing I've been telling people year after year when they ask about my childhood. So I think they must have really happened.
So from what you do remember, could you describe what it was like to leave or escape Laos?
You know, for me as a 5 or 6-year-old, it wasn't traumatic, because I didn't, as a child that age, you're very innocent. Even though you're going through the escape, the crossing the river at night, I did not have the same fear as the adults did with the guards in the watchtower and knowing that they have guns, and if we get caught, we could go to prison. I didn't think about that naturally as a child that young. So it wasn't traumatic or scary for me. It's like, oh, okay, we're gonna go out at night, get on a boat and go across a river. And then when we arrived at the Thai refugee camp, I only remember, honestly, good memories. I remember just being happy there because I didn't realize the situation that we were in. I was just like, oh, we have a house, we have pigs, we have chickens, we have ducks. I can play on the dirt roads with chickens and other animals, go out to this huge field and catch grasshoppers. Okay. You have to realize that in a refugee camp in Asia, Southeast Asia, we don't have beef, and because you rarely eat meat, right? Because that's an expensive product, and you don't want to kill your livestock, your chicken, because you want them to lay eggs. So very often, you don't have meat. So other proteins that we would have would be bugs. So I remember we would go out to the big field and catch grasshoppers and beetles, and we would bring them home and they would be cooked and we would eat them. And I remember I liked eating them, that they were delicious. And as a matter of fact, when we first moved to Kingsport, Tennessee, we did connect with another Asian family in a nearby town. And I remember that when we would go to their house, you know, they had beetles around their house, and I remember catching them, and we would bring them home, and then we would stir fry them and eat them.
Well, now that you're older and you know more about what was happening in your home country at that time, does that change how you look back at that point in your life? And if it does, how?
You know, it doesn't change how I look. I just try to think, well, it must have been really hard for my parents. But because I was so young, I still, in my mind, think that was a good time of my life, because it wasn't traumatic. I don't remember it being traumatic. I just remember I was happy running around shoeless and, you know, playing, catching bugs and playing with chickens.
So now that we've talked about everything up to this point in your life, do you mind if I ask, how do you want to be remembered after having all of these experiences?
You know, I just want to be remembered as being a very kind, tolerant, respectful person. I want to be remembered that I treat everybody fairly and kindly and respectfully.
And what would you want your grandchildren to know about you?
That I love them very much, and that I did what I could for them, and I spent, if I do have grandchildren, I love them to death, and love spending time with them, spoiling them.
And is there anything more that you want to say before we finish the interview?
I want to say that our family was very, very lucky having come to America. America was very, very good to us. Now, I didn't go to France, so I can't compare, but all I can say is that I'm grateful that we were sponsored to America. My parents, I think, really truly is a successful story, even though our family at times had a lot of conflict. But you know, they came here not speaking English, didn't have any money, but they had, you know, like the church group people who cared and supported them, and so they were able to learn the language, find jobs, and bought a house, own a business, and they both are now retired, and they're not living paycheck to paycheck. You know, they don't really have to worry about money.
So it looks like the interview's over. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
We really appreciate everything that you had to say and getting to learn more about you and what your life has been.
You are very welcome.